So the latest figures for the United Kingdom COVID-19 deaths in hospitals is 7,097 today. Um, and we had over 900 deaths in the last 24 hours. So we're now going up at about, it'll be close to 1,000 a day. Seems to be the sort of trajectory that Italy and Spain and France were on. In fact, France yesterday had 1,400 deaths. So really, these five countries, Britain, France, Spain, Italy, and the United States, seem to be getting the brunt of reported deaths. But like I say, the methodology around this is differs from country to country, and I still think that when it hits developing countries in Africa and parts of Asia hard, then we'll really see that in parts of South America. What I want to talk about here, and the other good news is the Prime Minister's health seems to be recovering, although he's still in intensive care. In South Africa, warring gangs in Cape Town apparently have put their differences aside to help deliver food to the community. Hopefully, that will be a long-term thing, and hopefully, this will have positive side effects as well. I want to talk about analogies with the spirit of the Blitz, which has got kind of iconic status in the United Kingdom. It's kind of a cultural legend that is deeply ingrained in the British psyche. So I want to talk a bit about the analogies because there is a risk that we can overuse those analogies. I think I think the challenges are in different forms. Um, and I've heard different things. I've heard people who have lived through it are downplaying the comparison to say, no, it's nothing like that. It's just staying at home for a while. But another elderly woman called LBC, apparently I didn't hear it, but it was like on the little headline. Um, she was 93, she was a child in the Blitz, and she said that it was this is worse. This is actually worse in terms of the restrictions. So I'm just going to read out part of the article from Wikipedia. To be clear here, the Blitz refers to that strategic German bombing campaign in the beginning of the Second World War. It doesn't refer to all of the bombing throughout the war, because after the Blitz, there was also a series of V2 rocket raids right up to, I believe, right up until early 1945. But the Blitz was that intense period of bombing from specifically the 7th of September 1940 to the 11th of May 1941. A single day in 1941, May 1941, over 1,000 people died in London's East End. But the Blitz killed between 40 and 43,000 British civilians. The total, I understand from air raids in World War II, was 68,000. So that means about two-thirds, just under two-thirds, were from the Blitz. Um, it's a lot of people. In addition, some 46 to 139,000 were injured, and some 2 million houses were destroyed. 60% of the houses in London. Now, it also has to be said that this is only a fraction of what the Allies done to Germany, and I'm not making any sort of statement with that. It's just a fact. Um, Germany had about 500,000 fatalities, civilian fatalities, from Allied air raids on German cities. I mean, more people died in the city of Hamburg alone than all the air raids on Britain during the Blitz. So that sort of puts it into context. It could be because we were an island. It could be because Axis resources were diverted for Operation Barbarossa in 1941. I think there's a range of reasons for that. But regardless, fatalities in Germany were horrendous. About 500,000 civilians killed in the air raids on their cities. And I'm not making any sort of political statement with that. I'm just saying it. So we remember the spirit of the Blitz as a sort of national patriotic thing. We all came together, we got through it, and I think that's very true. But I also think it's important not to over sentimentalize it, in the sense of we need to dispel some of the myths. There were opportunists in the Blitz. There were people who done some quite cowardly things. You know, they looted businesses. There was the case of Gordon Cummins, the so-called Blackout Ripper, who was a serial killer. He actually targeted women during the Blitz. He raped and killed several women. He was hanged during a air raid. Um, so Sometimes I think we oversimplify history by saying this generation's great and the current generation's all, selfish or whatever. I think you get examples of heroism in every generation, including this one, and you also get less romantic aspects of humanity in every generation. So I'm just reading out here from Wikipedia just for simplicity's sake, but this is what it says about the spirit of the Blitz, what's true and what's not true. Although the intensity of the bombing was not as great as pre-war expectations, so an equal comparison is impossible, no psychiatric crisis occurred because of the Blitz, even during the period of greatest bombing of September 1940. An American witness wrote, "By every test and measure I am able to apply, these people are staunch to the bone and won't quit. The British are stronger and in a better position than they were at its beginning." People referred to raids as if they were weather, stating that a day was very blitzy. According to Anna Freud and Edward Glover, London civilians surprisingly did not suffer from widespread shell shock, unlike the soldiers in the Dunkirk evacuation. Psychoanalysis were correct, and a special network of psychiatric clinics opened to receive mental casualties of the attacks closed due to lack of need. I must admit, I wasn't even familiar that such a thing existed in the 40s. I thought more focus on mental health was something that came later, so that's news to me. Um, Although the stress of the war resulted in many anxiety attacks, eating disorders, fatigue, weeping, miscarriages, and other physical and mental ailments, society did not collapse. The number of suicides and drunkenness declined, and London recorded only about 2 cases of bomb neurosis per week in the first 3 months of bombing. So you probably find during the Great Depression, suicide rates were actually higher because there was class issues with that. People were out of work. Work actually continued during the war, and if anything, there were more jobs in a sense, because more essential jobs were required. So that's interesting. Many civilians found that the best way to retain mental stability was to be with family, and after the first few weeks of bombing, avoidance of the evacuation programs grew. The cheerful crowds visiting bomb sites were so large they interfered with rescue work. Pub visits increased in number, beer was never rationed, and 13,000 attended cricket at Lord's. People left shelters when told instead of refusing to leave, although many housewives reported they enjoyed the break from housework. Some people even told government surveyors that they enjoyed air raids if they occurred occasionally because perhaps once a week, which is kind of hard to comprehend. Despite the attacks defeating Norway and France and the threat of invasion, overall morale remained high. A Gallup poll found only 3% of Britons expected to lose the war in May 1940. Another found an 88% approval rating for Churchill in July, and the third found 89% support for his leadership in October. Support for peace negotiations declined from 29% in February. Each setback caused more civilians to volunteer to become unpaid local defence volunteers. Workers worked longer shifts and over weekends. Contributions rose to £5,000 to Spitfire funds to build fighters, and the number of workdays lost to strikes in 1940 was the lowest in history. A lot of that is surprising to me, certainly about the lower rate of suicide and drunkenness. I am genuinely surprised by that. Um, but I think that's a little bit overly optimistic. I also think, if you'd seen neighbours literally blowing limb from limb, if you'd seen that sort of stuff, I find it very hard to believe that there wouldn't have been some psychological side effect from that. And definitely there would have been very, very strong anti-German sentiments, understandably so. So I'm a little reluctant to. I think the problem with making comparisons with this situation is that with the Blitz, Britain was really alone as a major power. The United States hadn't entered the war, Russia hadn't entered the war, France had collapsed, Benelux had collapsed. So Britain as a power really did stand alone. Um, I don't think we can overplay that. So the film Darkest Star with Gary Oldman, I do think it's a nail on the head in terms of just how dangerous the situation was. The difference today is we're on the same boat with France, with Italy, with Spain, with the United States. All these countries are suffering in similar rates. So we're not alone in that sense. Um, I do think Johnson's approval ratings are going to be quite high, partly because he has obviously personally suffered, but he has the sort of charisma of a Churchill type leader. I'm not saying he is or he isn't Churchill, he's Boris Johnson. But I think there are some analogies when we see 500,000 people volunteering for the NHS, when we see the collective sense that we are in a national emergency, when we see, I think one thing where it's actually harder than that time is the restrictions. I mean, during the Blitz, weddings continued, baptisms continued, people went to the pub, trams continued operating, shops opened, and the danger was from instantaneous violent death. And I'm sure that would have been absolutely horrendous. In a sense, the challenge today is greater because the social requirements are more challenging insofar as we are all isolating. You know, when I heard that case of the 13-year-old boy whose family couldn't attend his funeral in London, there's going to be many cases like that. So I do believe we're going to look back at this as quite a dark time in our history, but also a time when we saw the best of the British nation and the worst as well. You know, with these disgusting attacks on NHS workers. But during the Blitz, it's not a case that everyone was in it together. Like I say, there were opportunists. There were thieves who would take advantage of the blackouts to rob places. And whilst the Coventry Blitz is well documented, it also, London, of course, was pulverised, the East End in particular, but Birmingham, Bristol, there was resentment in Hull because Hull was kind of dismissed by the London press as a northeast town, and it kind of got secondary news, even though it was very hard hit. Plymouth, here in Sunderland, there were 267 deaths. Newcastle, 144. Belfast was very hard hit. Um, Clydebank, often it's said Glasgow, actually it was Clydebank, was a big target in Scotland because that's where the docks were in Greater Glasgow. Some big cities got off relatively lightly by comparison. Edinburgh and Leeds didn't get as hit as hard as, for example, Sheffield or Clydebank. Um, Bristol, Portsmouth, Plymouth, Southampton all hit hard, all the port cities. Cardiff, Swansea. Then, of course, there was the Baedeker Blitz, which was on cathedral cities, which had no real military importance, places like Canterbury and York and Bath. I believe Exeter was also hit. So I think it's difficult to make analogies because they're two different kinds of challenges. I don't think this is less of a challenge than that period, though. I mean, it's extraordinary to be saying this when we mark the anniversaries of the Second World War, we're thinking that generation went through so much. But quite honestly, the longer this thing goes on, the sort of mental health effects that people may go through, the increasing number of deaths. I came across one report earlier suggesting that Britain may even, and this isn't, a concrete report, it's not universally accepted, and we're going to hear a lot of things like this, but by August, British deaths could be as high as 66,000. That would far surpass the Blitz. So, um, I would say, I mean, I'm reluctant to make comparisons because I did not go through that time, and most of us didn't. So those who did go through it would be in a better position to really judge. But I certainly don't think that it we should be flippant about it. And for Piers Morgan to say, "Oh, it's just a case of people staying at home," we know there's going to be real challenges with this. I mean, I do feel a sense of I feel a patriotic sense that there is a genuine public spirit out there, and I'm going to try and see what I can do in terms of playing my part with volunteering. In fact, the call lines have been for the NHS have been so overwhelmed they've had to stop the application process at the moment. So that really says something about the British people. Um, I want to do something to do my part, but a lot of people are suffering as well. So I don't think we should downplay this. This is a national emergency, and I mean I watched a documentary yesterday on the Great Smog of 1952, so many people died over a few days. Um, we may find the actual death toll from this is even higher because that 7,097 figure is that taken from hospitals. It's not including people who've died at home. So we may find the actual tolls a lot higher. But one does get the impression this is something we are going to remember as defining for this generation. So summed up, I don't think we should make direct comparisons to the Blitz because it's not the same thing. We're not facing a foreign adversary in the same way, although certainly our ties with China are definitely going to have to be re-examined. But the enemy in this case is a virus, not a hostile foreign state raining bombs on us. It's a different sort of killer. I guess a better comparison would be how people coped during the Spanish flu. That's probably a better analogy. And that's been relatively underreported because so much focus is on the First World War. So it may be better to look at how we coped as a nation with the Spanish flu. And I know that in the early months of that, it was just treated like regular flu. People didn't know how severe it was. It was only in the decades afterwards, subsequent studies found the mortality was so immense. And just as a point of reference, the death toll from Spanish flu in Britain was 220,000. The death toll from the Black Death in the Middle Ages was over 1 million. So we're still well below those sort of figures, but we're only 1 month into this. So who knows where this could go. But anyway, that's my thoughts on comparisons between the Blitz and now. It was challenging in a different way. And I think we have to be a little bit cautious about saying we now know what it's like to go through what they went through, but the restrictions of that time were actually less. And to me, that's a very sobering thought that in the Second World War, the restrictions were actually less. That's quite a thought. In other words, we've never had restrictions like this in modern times. It's quite a thought.